the biggest sort of immediate visual difference other than the stripes is that they have what we call Mickey Mouse ears. So their ears are large and rounded as opposed to sort of pointy and donkey-like.
Thanks for tuning into Tusk Talks, a podcast that explores and shares the extraordinary life stories of dynamic and inspirational conservationists working across Africa today. From the coastal deserts of Namibia to the islands of the Comoros and the wildlife-rich uplands of northern Kenya, in this podcast we meet the progressive change makers who are dedicating their lives to protecting Africa's wildlife and wild places and to empowering local communities. My name is Joanna Eede, and I am a nature storyteller and head of communications for Tusk. I'll talk to some of the beneficiaries of the Lewa Safari Marathon, a collaboration between Tusk and the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya. In this episode, I'll be talking to David Kimiti, who is an ecologist and director at Grevy Zebra Trust. Where are you based, David?
So personally, I'm based in Nanyuki, but we work in Samburu and Marsabit counties primarily, with a little bit of work now in Isiolo and Laikipia counties. So that's in northern Kenya.
And could you give our listeners a little bit of background about Grevy Zebra and the Grevy Zebra Trust and why it is so important to conserve the zebra?
The Grevy zebra is an endangered zebra species. There's 3 zebra species in Africa, and the Grevy zebra is the most endangered of them. There's only roughly 3,000 remaining in the wild. And we used to have close to between 15,000 to 20,000 in the 70s and 80s. And then there was a poaching crisis here around that time, and we dropped to pretty close to 2,000 by the end of that poaching crisis. And then from then on, it's been kept low because primarily of habitat issues. So either fragmentation, but mostly land degradation. So reduction of their regular habitats and reconstriction of their movements, and then just continuing competition with pastoral communities and other herbivores for the ever-dwindling resources in the north of Kenya. So they are only found in Kenya north of the equator up to the southern tip of Ethiopia. So that's where almost the entire population is situated.
So that's their home. That's where they're indigenous to, is it?
Yes, that's where they're indigenous to. They used to cover a lot more of the Horn of Africa back in the day. They're very much adapted to dryland areas, so that area is pretty much their bread and butter. But over time, that's become more and more difficult for them to survive in, just because of increased degradation, the rainfall problems and challenges. So that's really kept their numbers low over the last several decades.
So there's a climatic influence here as well?
Yes, it's the combination of the climatic uncertainties sort of marrying the land degradation. So the land is not as resilient as it used to be to climatic, ups and downs. So it really, the climate shifts are the catalyst really, but the actual problem is the land degradation, because if the land degradation was to be reversed, then the landscape would be a lot more resilient to the shifting climate. So that's really the crux of the problem.
For the sake of our listeners, could you describe the differences between the zebra that most people will imagine and Grevy zebra, the distinction in their physical attributes?
Yes, of course. So the other type of zebra that people are most familiar with is the plains or common zebra. The Grevy zebra compared to the plains, the Grevy zebra is larger. It's in fact considered the largest wild equid. The Grevy zebra is larger, taller. The trademark body characteristics are the stripes are much thinner. So it's much thinner stripes than the regular plain zebra, which has sort of thick, blocky stripes. And those stripes in the Grevy zebra don't go around the stomach. So the belly is white in the Grevy zebra compared to the plain zebra. It has a brown muzzle, whereas the plain zebra has a black muzzle. And then the biggest sort of immediate visual difference other than the stripes is that they have what we call Mickey Mouse ears. So their ears are large and rounded as opposed to sort of pointy and donkey-like, which is what the plain zebra looks like. So it's pretty easy to distinguish between the two when you see them next to each other, because you'll immediately realize one is larger and stripes are different and the ears are different. So, but maybe from a cold photo, you might not immediately appreciate that difference.
And is there any understanding as to the evolutionary reason for the difference in ears? Is it to do with the terrain they evolved on, or?
Well, yeah, I think I haven't really studied the literature as much recently, but I think there was a lot to do with they live in really hot areas. They live in areas where there's probably the prey density is a bit sparse, so they would tend to get, they're definitely on the menu in some of these places. And I think it's just a combination of all these factors. I again, like I said, like my immediate animal behavior memory in terms of why the ears are of that shape isn't as sharp, which is that's actually a very good question that I that I'll probably now spend some time reading into just to remind myself.
Mm-hmm. So going to the Grevy Zebra Trust, what is your role specifically? Could you outline that and how and the work of the trust?
So the trust really was born out of our one of our founding directors' vision and work in Lewa Wildlife Conservancy, where she was working on one of the Grevy zebra monitoring projects that was then looking at the Grevy zebra in the community areas. And at that point, there wasn't really a structure for conservation in the community areas. This was before the birth of the Northern Rangelands Trust, so there wasn't really anybody doing sort of comprehensive conservation in these areas. And really, out of a desire to understand the Grevy's population in these community areas more, she started employing scouts in some of these community lands to see where the animals were going. And over time, there was a realization that some of these community areas were actually quite important from the Grevy zebra life cycle in terms of breeding areas, but also in terms of just general conservation. There was quite a lot of populations in those community areas. And so over time, the partners from the St. Louis Zoo got together and created the Grevy Zebra Trust as a small project in some of these in one of these community conservancies, and then just sort of grew from there. So it's really the only organization that is fully uh, sort of designed just for the Grevy zebra conservation. The thing that makes it unique is that their vision wasn't really about the interventions per se with regards to the animal, but interventions within the community with regards to rangeland management and landscape regeneration, and really trying to see how mixed use systems could be conserved without necessarily separating the pastoralists from the wildlife, and just sort of really going back to the tools and tips and techniques they used to use, pre-colonialism and the rest of the sort of modernization happened. There's been obviously a lot of breakdown in traditional pastoral coping mechanisms, and so the Grevy Zebra Trust at that point was really trying to see how we could utilize that indigenous knowledge, marry it with whatever the cutting edge practices are in livestock keeping and sort of open range management, and changing our strategy over time to see what was working best. And so in the last since the Grevy Zebra Trust was formed in around 2007, we've had a few different strategic plans, and we sort of change each plan depending on the findings from the previous years, the monitoring results from the previous years, and that really helps us understand when our interventions are working and when they're not working. And yeah, the idea is to just keep conserving and growing the population of Grevy zebra in northern Kenya, and adapting our interventions to that end, really.
The combination of indigenous knowledge and combined with contemporary methods, for want of a better word, sounds like a recipe for success. Can you enumerate some of the indigenous knowledge and methods that you adopt?
Yeah, I think the easiest to point at is really our rangelands work. We've been working for a long time using holistic land and livestock management, which is a tool, a technique that was developed by the Savory Institute in Southern Africa for several years back, a few decades ago. But it's not just copy pasting what they're doing there. It's really trying to learn and understand the concepts there, and then coming here and seeing how does that work within the traditional structure of the grazing committees, the sort of the elders that make decisions. And really, it's marrying those two methods in. So it's less us coming and dictating what the community should do, but coming and saying, hey, these methods or these ways of livestock keeping, herding animals together as opposed to multiple different, tiny herds spread across the landscape, bring all your herds together and graze together, set aside land, because now we don't have the luxury of what they used to do, which is move large distances, hundreds of kilometers throughout the year without restriction. So how do we change that and adapt that to sort of the restricted access to land they have now? And so that means a lot more intensive management of the places where they have land tenure, so clearly assigned to them, and seeing how you can make the land last throughout the grazing cycle without getting degraded. And so, relying on the community to let us know what is likely to make those interventions successful. Who do we need to involve? What structures of the traditional, especially Samburu, because that's the majority culture where we are. How do we get these methods accepted and taken on by the indigenous pastoral community? And it's using those tips and techniques to really try and, execute whatever interventions we decide are working. And it's also feedback coming in back from the community. This is not how we do things. This is usually what we do, and then we see how we work around that, trying to bring in new structures that complement rather than conflict with the traditional way of doing things.
It's a two-way conversation that you're having continuously, backwards and forwards, adapting and organically growing and listening and changing as the years go on.
Yes, exactly. And it has to be, otherwise, if we stick to, we sort of have to give ourselves the room to fail in order to succeed. Because if we sort of keep trying to make interventions and we give up every time, we have a little bit of failure without learning from it, or sort of if we sort of punish ourselves for any interventions that fail, then we really would never have gotten to where we are today, where we've been able to iterate our goals and objectives and exactly what indicators we are looking at in terms of success with the communities. And so, but it's also very important to for the communities to see the success themselves. So we have a lot of what we call learning sites, where before we implement these interventions at the large scale, we do them at a small scale first in some of the, if you want to call them, the worst areas or the most degraded areas, and basically provide proof of concept that they work. And then that's much easier for the community to come and take a look at, see, okay, this might work actually where we are. We also do a lot of sort of benchmarking with them. We go to different communities where some of those interventions have worked. And then they can come back and discuss and decide what they want to implement. And we act more as facilitators and teachers, if you will, rather than actual implementers. Because that's also the only way it can remain sustainable, is if the community itself is the one that is wanting to implement those changes.
You mentioned the Samburu, and I know that Tusk helps to fund some of the warrior work. Can you describe the warriors, the Moran, and the role they have within Grevy Zebra Trust?
So the different places that the Grevy Zebra Trust works in has different staff based on what the needs on the ground are. So the warrior program is based up in one of our regions called Laisamis, which is in Marsabit. It's a mix of Samburu and Rendile culture, so it's blended. It's predominantly Samburu, but there's also quite a few Rendile groups in there. And this area is really characterized by tough terrain, dry, sort of vast landscapes, a lot of lava plateaus. It's really harsh terrain to drive to even try and drive through. Motorbikes are even not that useful in a lot of these lava plateaus. And so it really needs a lot of foot patrolling, which over time it was really understood that the group that was best suited for this was the young Morans, the full of energy, sort of they can walk, tens of kilometers in a day just regularly, doing herding. And so they are the best group to really focus on with regards to monitoring some of these vast, inaccessible areas that have some very important Grevy zebra populations. And so originally it was really the program was really designed around us getting more information on where the Grevies are in those spaces and trying to understand what those populations look like. As that picture became a bit clearer, then the role of the warriors also started expanding towards community engagement, talking to the communities, creating awareness about the Grevy zebra, just sort of building value within the community around what Grevy zebra, the animal, is to the community. And then also in addition, now we are working with them to also, a few of them have been transitioned to, or the old cohort has been transitioned into what we are calling grassland champions, and they work now within the community exclusively on rangelands work. So sort of again trying to build that momentum within the community on rangeland health, management and restoration work within the community. So we now have those two groups now, the warriors and the grassland champions. And the grassland champions are simply our previous cohort of warriors that graduated within the community. They're no longer warriors now within the community. They're considered junior elders, so we couldn't really retain them as warriors. And yeah, these guys are amazing. They patrol vast distances, often sometimes camping in very rough conditions. And without them, we really wouldn't understand the status of the animals in these areas. And so, yeah, they're critical to our mission.
And you wouldn't understand the status of the animals because they count them. They could you elaborate on that?
So we've transitioned them. They use the spatial monitoring and researching tool, so SMART. So they have smartphones. And during their surveys, they're able to collect information on demographics, so the number of animals, the number of adults, the number of juveniles, the number of females versus males, and then their distribution. So the data that they send back every month allows us to create sort of demographic.
Yes, no, I see. It's incredible how technology is really helping. Over such a vast areas, it's such a game changer, isn't it? The use of such technology.
Yes, very much so. It's really the previous data collection tools were paper based, and so it would take time to reach the morans, collect all their data sheets, assuming they have all their data sheets during their hikes and their surveys. Nowadays, with the phone, they just simply need to get somewhere where there's network, and they upload the data into the cloud, and we're able to receive it in our systems. And so almost real time, data transmission from the ground to ourselves, which allows us to very quickly be able to tell where the animals are, what body conditions they're in, and also how we are looking with regards to juveniles and foals versus adult animals, which is a critical marker for Grevy zebra health. So just knowing the ratio of juveniles and foals to adults is a crucial marker for us, and we wouldn't really be able to tell that in any sort of temporal resolution if it wasn't for the warrior program. So we'd probably do surveys every few months, but these teams are giving us this information almost on a daily basis.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little about how meaningful Grevy zebra are to the Samburu culture? I mean, imagine that must go back a long way.
Yeah, it's quite easy to explain, because I think they talk about it all the time, how obviously it's a unique animal that's only really found within their area. So nowadays that's one of the points of pride. I think it's considered by the Samburu to be one of their five animals, or the Samburu big five as they call them. But traditionally, actually, there were just a lot more. The communities relied on them to find things like water, because these animals are, yes, they are hardy, but they need water every few days. And so one of the tools or tricks the young herdsmen used to use is finding Grevy zebra tracks and following them and trying to follow Grevy zebra, because they'd tell them where the water was. So they'd follow Grevy zebra to find water. And then, yeah, the animals are just sort of very well integrated within the community. Even today, you'll find them grazing very close to homesteads. The Grevy zebra tend to like spending time in the community lands, especially at night, because there's fewer predators in community lands at night, and so these communities have really evolved with the Grevy zebra in a very close manner. And they, Samburu especially, don't have a history of hunting the Grevy zebra or poaching the Grevy zebra, except those, like I said, the poaching crisis in the 70s. And even these days, it's really, there's a lot more Grevy zebra dying due to conflict rather than poaching itself. And poaching is not for subsistence; it's usually commercial in really bad years where the communities really don't have anything else to sustain themselves. So it's not very difficult to convince these communities of the value of the Grevy zebra because intrinsically they already have pretty decent value. They understand intrinsically that the animal is a rare species. They don't always understand how rare it is, but they do know it's different from the zebra they see everywhere else down south in the wetter areas of the country. So yeah, it's not very difficult to sort of create value, if you will, for the Grevy zebra in these communities.
Yes, I see. Could you describe a little your inspiration and background and how you came to be a conservationist?
Yeah, so I started off, studying elephants for my master's. I was actually looking at elephant distribution and use of woody vegetation, and it sort of occurred to me that I didn't understand why elephants were eating different species during different times of the year. And that sort of brought me around to trying to understand how different soils and topography and structures of the landscape influence vegetation types and distribution. And that sort of led me to really doing a lot of work in land potential evaluation, which is basically just trying to understand what types of vegetation can grow in what places. And that's crucial from a restoration point of view, because otherwise you could be trying to carry out restoration work or ecological restoration in places where those species can't grow because of the natural limitations. And so this work really led me into doing a lot of work on ecological restoration and monitoring and evaluation of those restoration projects. I switched really from pure research to being more interested in rangelands and rangeland restoration for a conservation purpose rather than from an academic perspective. So I initially got a job at Lewa Wildlife Conservancy as their head of research, looking at all the different animals and trying to create all these systems for understanding them, monitoring them, and trying to see what interactions they were having with the landscape. And then the Grevy Zebra Trust really attracted me because it was a species based organization whose model was really based on the land, so the landscape itself, so rangeland management, which is really my point of interest, is how rangeland management can influence ecological conservation. And really that's how I got into the Grevy Zebra Trust, is that desire to work at a larger scale than just at the time I was working just at Lewa. And so this is working on a much broader scale with a lot of different partners and communities, from the community conservancies to the national reserves to private conservancies, now that we're moving into Laikipia, all the while still working with obviously Lewa and Borana and some of those other private conservancies that are crucial for Grevy zebra conservation. And so it's really been, I sometimes call myself the accidental scientist, because I can't say that anything I'm doing with my life I actually purposefully planned or wanted to do since I was a child. That would be a lie. Most of the things have been sort of almost organic evolution as questions came up through my career, and trying to understand and decide what was most important from an ecological or ecosystem perspective. Because it's fun to study elephants, but it's even more fun to figure out, what those elephants, how you can get them what they need in terms of forage and water and the rest. So that's really how I came into general conservation. And Grevy zebra conservation in particular was really because I was drawn to the systems perspective that the Grevy Zebra Trust was using rather than species focused interventions.
I see. And in terms of the Lewa Safari Marathon, are you aware of, and can you explain for the listeners the impact that that has created in terms of Grevy zebra conservation?
So, like I said, I used to work at Lewa, and so I'm very familiar with the marathon very intimately. And the Grevy zebra is one of Lewa's sort of keystone species. Whether it was when I was at Lewa or now at Grevy Zebra Trust, we've always worked together as part of the Grevy Zebra Technical Committee. In terms of the funding of the marathon itself, outside sort of institutional collaboration, the funding of the marathon itself has been crucial for the Warriors program, because that's really been what we've been using for providing equipment to the Warriors. The marathon funding through Tusk has also been critical to, like I said, transitioning the Warriors, the previous cohort of Warriors, into grassland champions who are now doing rangelands work in Samburu. But and year to year, the Tusk Marathon is almost entirely relied on for logistics for our teams in Lysamis. So being able to reach out to the warriors, being able to transport them from one area to another, holding annual workshops and refresher trainings, just basically providing them whatever help they need. The task funding was crucial for us to be able to transition the warriors to using smartphones. So we were able to, using the marathon funding, to buy new phones for the warriors teams, buy power banks, buy solar chargers, things without which their work in that landscape would be nearly impossible to carry out. There's not really any place for them to go, charge their phones at night, if they don't have these solar chargers and batteries. So I'd say from 2017, I think, which is when the first Warriors project was funded by Tusk, um, we've relied on Tusk to provide support for logistics and for equipment purchase for those teams. And without Tusk support, it would be a lot more difficult to execute, our mandate in that area. We wouldn't have been able to expand the mission in that area. We'd still probably be collecting, regular data every few months as opposed to the daily type of data that we are getting right now.
Yes, gosh, that really is quite an impact, isn't it? I mean, that
Hmm.
again, that's a game changer. Could you briefly sort of lay out the a typical day in the life of a warrior looks like in terms of the Grevy zebra work?
So the Warriors have, I'd say, two types of days. If they're doing just their regular surveys within their own areas near their own homes where they come from, it's really getting up as a pair and walking out in the morning, trying to find Grevy zebra tracks, trying to find Grevy zebra areas in the areas where they've been assigned. So each of them is assigned a patrol block, and so they patrol that area from the morning through the sort of the hotter parts of the day when they take a break, and again in the evening when it cools down again. And they basically just patrol their blocks looking for signs of gravies. Anytime they find a group, they take photos, they record the information that we've asked them to record. So, in terms of numbers, in terms of demographic distribution, in terms of if they see anything wrong with the animal with regards to body condition, in terms of if they see any weak animals that they need to report back to that need intervention, because we have a vet unit in the area. Um, and then also looking at just the condition of the resources, so whether that's forage resources or water resources. So they'll also go around and look at the water points in their blocks, seeing if there's any issues in those water points. Um, so that's the regular, what we call foot patrols. Then we have something called the plateau patrol to differentiate it. So the plateau patrol is where all the warriors get together now as a group, all 10 of them get into vehicles. So these are not foot patrols in the normal sense where they move from their homes. This is now they're taken to a central point where they camp, and then they do a joint plateau patrol together. They sort of now cover vast distances in a short period of time as a group, and are able to share ideas and share, looking at different areas where it's a bit difficult for any singular team to survey. So they then share that load with the regional coordinator, who also helps with that. And then finally, the regional coordinator also helps them. The third type of survey they do is what we call the joint patrol, which is where they now include other partners like the Kenya Wildlife Service, the local whatever conservation organization is there. So in their case, it's usually the Lewa Conservancy and other stakeholders that might be interested. So they do joint patrols together with those other rangers from those other teams. Um, then also these rangers also do community outreach, which is when they're in their home areas, they either take advantage of meetings that have been set up by the community, leadership, and they take that chance to meet with the community and talk to them about a Grevy zebra. So this will mainly involve participating in what we call barazas, or community, informal meetings, and they'll talk to the people in those meetings about Grevy zebra conservation in general. So yeah, the type of day will depend on the task that they're doing that day, but it's usually either foot patrols, plateau patrols, joint patrols, or community outreach meetings, throughout the week.
Lovely. Well, that's really interesting, David. Thank you. Just to sort of round up on a couple of fun facts. Is it true that the Grevy zebra is more closely related to an ass than a horse?
Yeah, genetically, yes, that's the case. I think it is, as far as I can remember. Yes, that's the case.
The stripe pattern is as unique as a human fingerprint. Is that right?
Yep, that is completely true. That's actually one of the ways we identify them individually is using the stripes.
All right. Yeah. And finally, is it historically true that they were used in Roman amphitheaters and circuses?
I don't know whether it was the Grevy zebra specifically. I think it was zebras in general. Whoever had a zebra nearby, be called upon.
Yes. Okay. Well, David, it's been lovely to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Really interesting overview of the work you carry out and the vital work you carry out. So thank you for joining us.
No worries at all. Thank you, and thank you for the invite.
Thank you for listening to Tusk Talks, stories from Africa's conservation voices. If you have enjoyed listening to the voices of Tusk's partners, please subscribe and share the podcast with friends and family. And if you would like to find out more about the Lewa Safari Marathon, the impact it has and the race itself, please head over to lewasafari.marathon.com and stay tuned for a sneak listen to the next episode.
I mean, Savo hosts 40% of Kenya's elephant population. Savo also hosts 18% of the country's black rhino population. So it's a very critical wildlife and wilderness area.